Kia ora, ngā mi o te ata. Hello and good morning. We're moving on to the second part of the presentation on government intervention in the market, and our focus as we finished the last video was on indirect taxes and how the market adjusts to an indirect tax being placed on it by the government. And so now our focus is going to be a little bit more detailed. We're going to zoom in a little bit to look at the concept known as tax incidence. And this concept is very useful for government in making decisions about what products to tax and how much. So let's go. So now we're going to look more closely at the impact of a sales tax, especially about who pays the tax. Is it just the consumer? Is it just the producer, or is it both of them? Do they both share the tax? And this concept is known as the incidence of a sales tax. The definition follows a little bit later. But let's look at this diagram here, and we can see that the original price was $1.10, P, Q, original quantity 100. The tax goes on. How much is the tax? Well, we can see immediately that the vertical distance, remember, between the two supply curves is equal to the per unit value of the tax. So $1.50 minus $1 is 50 cents. So we've identified the market price before tax as $1.10, or the letters P and Q. The market price paid by the consumer after the tax is $1.50. The per unit amount of tax, as we've already stated, is 50 cents, $0.5. The total tax paid by the government is 50 cents times the new quantity, 90 units. The total tax paid by the consumer is 40 cents times 90. And the total tax paid by the producer is what's left, which is 10 cents out of the 50 cents times 90. So once again, this refers to the same graph on slide 16, the tax on salt. And so the tax per unit, of course, is 50 cents. The total tax revenue collected by the government is $45. The total tax revenue paid by the consumer is $36. The producer pays $9, 36 plus 9, $45. The fourth question refers to why do consumers end up paying 40 cents while producers only pay 10 cents? Why is the incidence more heavy on the consumer than the producer? And so for that, we need to look at the curves and realize that the elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand, is much more inelastic than the price elasticity of supply. For this reason, when this happens, and it stands to reason, for example, where a good is a necessity, salt, that has few substitutes, and it's relatively cheap, that if the price changes because of the tax pushing the price up, then there's going to be a relatively small decrease in quantity demanded. So our three reasons why it's inelastic is because it has few close substitutes, it's a necessity, and it's cheap. It takes up a small percentage of total spending. So calculate the price elasticity of demand between $11 and $15. If you do it correctly, you should get 0.34, in other words, less than 1 inelastic. So let's summarize what we've discovered. The incidence of a sales tax refers, a good synonym, a good word to help you understand its meaning is the burden who carries the weight of the tax. In other words, who pays most of the tax? Is it the consumer or is it the producer? The incidence of a sales tax depends on the price elasticity of demand and supply. If demand is inelastic and supply is more elastic, the greater the incidence, the burden will fall on the consumer. Again, watch this video below, the video link, if you want more information. So have a go at this exercise. It's looking at who pays most of the tax. So if price elasticity of demand is inelastic, the good is likely to be a necessity, and therefore consumers will pay most of the tax. If the good is addictive, the incidence or burden of the tax will be carried by the consumer again. Very much like cigarettes. When the government increases the excise tax on cigarettes, it has little effect on smokers because of the addiction and the nicotine. So if the consumer has no close substitute, the incidence will be carried by the consumer. If the good is expensive, no. If the good is cheap and therefore takes up a smaller percentage of total spending, the consumer will end up paying most of the tax. So this example, we're going to look at the placing a sales tax on a caravan. A caravan is an item New Zealanders tend to use a little bit, Australians as well, as an alternative way of travelling around the country, and it's relatively cheap to do because you don't have to get a hotel or a motel. And so quite a few New Zealanders do hitch up their caravan to the back of their car, tow it around. So it's like having a home on wheels, or holiday home on wheels. And the requirements of this exercise is to show the effect of the sales tax, and you're told that the price will increase to $30,000. So you now just apply what you've learned. You know, sales tax will cause costs of production to rise, and so you need to then indicate all the changes, as many as you can, including the new price to the consumer, which is already stated, the amount of tax and paid by the consumer, the amount paid by the producer, the total amount of tax the government actually gets, and of course label the effective price the producer will receive as PP. All right, now you've had a good go at this, I hope, and now so what I'll do is I'll take you through the steps of drawing it. Now you know that the price will increase to $30,000, and you also know that a sales tax will cause the supply curve to shift up, or to the left. So you know the new equilibrium price is going to be at $30,000. And you know the supply curve will shift to that point. It will shift in a parallel movement. The gap or distance between the curves will not change. And from that, we can actually work out the per unit tax. Now, the tax revenue received by the government is equal to the per unit tax, which is the vertical distance. We could take it at any point, and we can see the per unit tax is $15,000. So to get the total amount of tax revenue received by the government, we simply take 15,000 and multiply it by the quantity sold, 200. Consumers pay $5,000 times the number of caravans purchased, 200. So we can see consumers are paying that amount while producers pay more. They're paying $10,000 times the 200 units sold. So we can see the incidence of the tax this time falls more heavily on the producer. The producer pays more tax than the consumer. And we can see by the relative gradients of the curves that the demand curve overall is much more elastic than the supply curve. And when demand is more elastic than supply, the producer will pay more of the tax. Of course, the producer gets what's left over, in this case 10,000 times 200. PP, the effective price, therefore, the producer receives. PC minus PP, the per unit amount of tax, 15,000. From here you can review by looking at the calculations and completing them. Let's go to the last question. Explain why the caravan producer pays most of the tax. And that is because demand is relatively elastic compared to the supply curve. And caravans are not a necessity, they're a luxury good. So they're much more sensitive to price changes because they are relatively expensive. They also have plenty of substitutes. Motels, batches, which are holiday homes, and various other choices one has to go on holiday. So probably we can say there are plenty of substitutes. It's a luxury good, and therefore it's expensive, and it's certainly not a necessity. So demand tends to be very elastic. The task in this example is the same. It's to show the effect of a sales tax on a good. This good is not identified. It's just called good Z. And so what I want you to do here is to show the effect on this good when the government places a 10,000 sales tax on each unit. Label the new curve after drawing it in the correct position, and label also the per unit value of the tax. Further, I want you to shade the total amount of tax collected and the total amount of tax paid by the consumer. When you've completed it, on the next slide are some calculations. The answers are there, but it's important that you actually show your working to make sure that you know how to calculate each part. So as we can see, the equilibrium price is about 22,500, and the quantity 175 units. A tax is imposed of $10,000 per unit, so the supply curve will move up by that amount, $10,000. So 30 minus 20, 10. And the vertical distance, remember, is the per unit value of the tax. Next, that's the amount of tax that is paid by the consumer, and that is the amount paid by the producer. Why does that happen? You can see because the demand curve is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve. So using the graph, you can complete the calculations and make sure that you show your working. And this is because I'm going to provide the answers, but you need to make sure the working is there so that later when you do your revision, you will remember how to do this. Question 3, you have to choose why does the incidence fall most heavily on the consumer? It's because price elasticity of demand is relatively inelastic compared to supply. So you choose the word. Make sure those calculations are with working as shown.